Welcome to The Explainer. Look, we all know the famous stories, right? Zeus, Athena, Apollo, they are the absolute bedrock of Western civilization. They shape the art, the politics, and the daily life of the entire ancient world. But here's a question for you. Was ancient Greek religion really just a collection of epic, entertaining tales? Well, today, we are going on a deep dive to uncover the hidden, often incredibly dark, and profoundly philosophical realities that sit right beneath the surface of those famous myths.
To put into perspective just how relevant this still is, get this. Just last year alone, global sales of books based on Greek mythology skyrocketed by a massive 120%. That is huge. This ancient belief system isn't just some dusty history lesson. It literally still holds this incredibly powerful grip on our modern imagination. We are clearly still captivated. But to truly understand why these stories resonate so deeply with us, we actually have to go back and figure out where they came from in the first place.
So here is our roadmap for today's journey. We'll be covering the origins, the shift to anthropomorphic gods, those wild mystery cults, the eventual transition from myth into philosophy, and finally, we'll look at the ideas of Epicurus and Zeno.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, Origins, the Dead and Nature.
Now, you might be surprised to hear this, but the earliest roots of ancient Greek religion didn't actually come from this majestic sense of wonder. They came from profound fear, total helplessness. Before all those grand, beautiful marble temples were ever built, the early Greeks were absolutely terrified of the overwhelming forces of nature, and they held a very literal, deep-seated belief in wandering ghosts. They genuinely believed the dead lived on down in their graves and actually craved interaction. So if you were brave enough, you wouldn't just pray from afar. You would physically go to the grave, summon the spirit using very specific magical spells, and, here's the crazy part, offer them fresh blood. Since blood was the essence of life, drinking it gave the ghosts a temporary spark of vitality so they could answer your questions. And this isn't just some spooky campfire story. This is the exact procedural method that the famous hero Odysseus used to communicate with the prophet Tiresias to get answers about his future.
But as you can probably guess, meddling with the dead or offering them fresh blood left a really serious spiritual stain on you. You couldn't just wrap up the ritual and go grab lunch. You absolutely needed a catharsis. This was a super strict purification ritual where you had to wash yourself in running water, like a river or the sea, to physically and spiritually cleanse yourself of that blood and guilt. If you ignored this extreme ancient form of spiritual hygiene, well, the Greeks believed there were tens of thousands of wandering spirits just waiting to unleash terrible vengeance, basically spreading disease and death across your whole community. So you definitely didn't skip the catharsis.
Beyond just the spirits of the dead, early Greeks practiced a really deep form of animism. They believed that everything, trees, rivers, birds, even stones, had a living soul. The will of the gods wasn't some hidden, abstract mystery. It manifested directly right in front of them through nature. A sudden lightning strike, the way a flock of birds flew, or a lunar eclipse. Those weren't just weather events or astronomy to them. They were literal, direct, divine messages. To give you an idea of just how seriously they took this, there's a historical account of an Athenian general who was so terrified by a lunar eclipse that his seers forced him to keep his entire army completely immobile for a whole month. And because of this absolute strict adherence to the signs of nature, his entire army was ultimately destroyed.
Moving on to part 2, Anthropomorphic Gods.
So as society slowly advanced into the Bronze Age, all those chaotic, localized nature spirits and terrifying ghosts started getting organized. This is where we enter the era of human-shaped gods forming a clear, powerful hierarchy. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. When we read Homer today, we tend to treat these gods as poetic metaphors. The early Greeks absolutely did not. To them, these gods were literal, physical entities with literal hands and feet. When they talked about the sun god Helios, they weren't talking about the scientific concept of a burning star. They believed there was a physical being literally driving a chariot drawn by 4 horses across the sky every single day. It was basically the ancient world's most intense Uber ride. And sitting right at the very top of this new hierarchy was Zeus. It's actually fascinating when you think about it, because Zeus is essentially a direct product of human helplessness in the face of nature. Think about the mythology for a second. Zeus overthrew the Titans. The Titans represented those raw, untamed, terrifying earth forces like earthquakes and volcanoes. By making Zeus this human-like king who controlled the lightning and the storms, humanity was basically trying to put a recognizable human face on the terrifying, chaotic forces of the sky. It was their way of bringing a sense of order to their deepest, darkest fears.
Let's dive into part 3, Mysteries and Fertility Cults. Eventually, though, having these human-like gods sitting all the way up on Mount Olympus felt a bit too distant for everyday people. People craved a much more direct, emotional connection to the divine. And that desire led to the rise of these ecstatic, highly intense mystery and fertility cults that were entirely centered around the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Take the cult of Attis, for example. They celebrated the arrival of spring on March 25th, and let me tell you, the rituals were fast-paced, bloody, and intense. Priests would intentionally wound themselves in mourning, and the initiates, they would partake in something called the tarobolium. This was a highly visceral ritual where a bull was sacrificed on a graded platform, and the initiate standing right underneath was literally bathed in its blood. They believed this completely cleansed their sins and allowed them to be spiritually reborn.
Then you had the cult of Dionysus, which actually originated over in Thrace. This involved nighttime worship with wild music, flaming torches, and, of course, lots of wine. The female worshippers, who were known as maenads, would go up into the mountains and enter a state of absolute, unrestrained frenzy. In this wild enthusiasm, these women didn't just want to see the god, they believed they actually became the god. They thought their souls literally left their physical bodies to unite directly with the divine. It was a complete and total surrender to raw, ecstatic emotion.
Which brings us to part 4, the transition from myth to philosophy.
But, this wild, bloody frenzy couldn't last forever. As Greek society advanced and became more complex, intellectuals and thinkers started looking around at these bloody rituals and the frankly immoral stories of the gods, and they basically said, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. They started rejecting those old chaotic myths in favor of structured logic and reason. Just looking back across this breathtaking timeline, it's amazing. We started with a prehistoric fear of nature and graves, then the Bronze Age brought those human-like gods, followed by classical antiquity's intense mystical cults. Finally, by the time we hit the Hellenistic period, those old cults had really lost their appeal. Figures like the Roman statesman Cicero eventually pointed out that hardly any educated person even believed in the old myths anymore. And it was exactly this complete rejection of the old gods that paved the pathway for the rise of moral philosophy and ultimately prepared the intellectual ground for the spread of Christianity.
And finally, part 5, Epicurus and Zeta.
So, with the old gods fading away, how did everyday people actually cope with living in a chaotic world? Well, enter the philosophers. What we see here is an incredible intellectual showdown between two brilliant minds. On one side, we have Epicurus. He looked at the world and declared that, hey, if the gods do exist, they are completely indifferent to us. They don't care. His philosophy, Epicureanism, taught that we have to seek balance. He said the ultimate goal in life is to remove the greatest terror of all, the fear of death, which he just described as a long sleep. To find peace, you have to avoid greed, avoid ambition, and avoid bodily excess. Just chill out. But on the exact opposite side, we have Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. Heavily influenced by Eastern thought, Zeno argued the exact opposite of chaos. He taught that the cosmos is strictly, perfectly governed by logic and duty. For a Stoic, virtue is absolutely everything. Pain isn't a sin. The only true sin is doing evil. In the Stoic worldview, even a slave, if they are virtuous, is truly a free person.
Now, Zeno and the Stoics anchored their entire belief system on this awe-inspiring concept called the Logos. They believed the Logos was this immortal fire, a divine logic that permeated absolutely everything in existence. It regulated the massive orbit of the stars up in the sky, all the way down to the reason inside your own human mind. Because of this, the Stoics held this incredibly beautiful, cosmopolitan view of reality. They believed the entire universe was just a single, massive republic, governed not by blind, chaotic chance, but by divine fate and supreme logic.
So we've traveled a long way today, from terrifying ghosts demanding fresh blood in the dirt, all the way to the high-minded supreme logic of the cosmos. But here's the thing. These philosophical coping mechanisms, they aren't just ancient history. They are highly, highly relevant today. As you navigate your own modern, often chaotic world, I want you to ask yourself, which ancient path gives you strength? Do you find yourself seeking the quiet, serene retreat of Epicurus? Or do you lean into the disciplined, structured duty of Zeno? Think about how you conquer your own chaos. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer, and I will see you all next time.